Civilization pride themselves upon their culture, that which makes them who they are. There are numerous values held throughout civilizations that characterize and form their culture. However, there is one value that every major civilization has held exceedingly greater than the rest: education. The Bible provides an example of education's importance in Romans 15:4. For what was written in former days was written for our instruction, so that through the endurance and through the encouragement of the Scriptures we might have hope. Great things come from civilizations that realize how important education is, and they must strive to protect it. America was a prodigy and example of exceptional education. Its founders built this foundation on core principles inspired from their classical belief of ancient societies, biblical truths, and modern critiques of civilizations of their time. This education in America gave birth to many great achievements and wonders. However, America's education today is nothing like it used to be. In 2022, Pete Hegseth, author of American Crusade and Modern Warriors, published his book, Battle for the American Mind. In that was the story of Yeonmi Park, a North Korean defector and later graduate of Columbia University. After her time spent in America's education system, she had this to say about it: "Even North Korea is not this nuts." She continued with a dire warning, stating that America's future is as bleak as North Korea's unless our self-loathing education system is overhauled. It's honestly surprising this was not the headline of every major media outlet in America. What happened to the exceptional education this country used to know? Hegseth states that in the early 20th century, the classical education system that built this country was put in the backstage, as education changed and transformed into what is known today in public educations and some private. In this new education system, corruption like a poison took hold, and from that corruption arose the Department of Education. The Department of Education has existed for almost half a century, almost 50 years, and yet is it doing anything important for this country's education? This is a highly controversial topic since its inception, and still is today. Many politicians, education experts, and especially parents question the effectiveness of the department. Their efforts combined has led to what can only be the absolute truth. The Department of Education is a hopeless and corrupt institution that has no place in America's education. To help provide how useless the Department of Education is, take a look at schools in urban areas. A great example would be Baltimore City. Baltimore City Public Schools is a district with over 77,000 students and a budget of almost $2 billion, 8% of which comes from federal funding. These schools have the funding and, as most big cities have, more attention from the government. Yet they are still academically suffering. U.S. News and World Report has their graduation rate at 86.5%. Their test score proficiencies also prove to be under par, with high school reading at 27%, and high school mathematics at a mere 4%. If this, however, is not enough, take a look at another big city, for instance, Chicago. U.S. News and World Report has their graduation rate at 75%, and also their test score proficiencies with high school reading at 50% and mathematics at 14%. These are two major cities in the U.S., and yet it seems as though they have been completely neglected by the Department of Education. Neglect of its duties should be the sole and only reason to call for its abolishment. However, there are many more. One of the primary emphasis should be the fact that the Department of Education has never been constitutional. As stated by Amendment 10 of the U.S. Constitution, the powers not delegated to the United States by this Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved for the states respectively or to the people. Nowhere in the Constitution is the right to oversee education mentioned. Therefore, the government has no right to have a department dedicated to it. Hundreds of politicians have stated this truth. However, Ronald Reagan sums it up saying, "Education is the principal responsibility of local school systems, teachers, state boards, and state governments, not the federal government." What more reason than the facts of the department's unconstitutional existence is needed to remove it? If more is still needed, then look no further than the next problem: corruption. The doubt that corruption has taken a stranglehold over the current education system is completely naive. How could one not be able to see it? It's as obvious as one jingling keys in front of another's face. Especially since the department itself is a product of corruption, it is now, like malware on a computer, spreading throughout the system, entangling and implanting destructive and harmful policies in any school it has the ability to influence. But one may ask, If the department is a product of corruption, then what corruption made it? That would be the corruptions of the teachers' unions working hand in hand with President Carter. Pete Hegseth elaborates on this, stating that it's a symbiotic relationship that goes back decades and started with President Carter in 1976. Carter rewarded the teachers' unions for their support of his campaign by fulfilling his promise he made to them, which was to create a federal Department of Education, which he did in 1979. This means that the Department of Education was not founded on the basis of bettering and improving education, as it states, but instead was the prize of a corrupt bargain. This should leave Americans with one question. Do they want to surrender their schools to a corrupt institution and its masters, or do they want a truthful and lively education for their children? Even just a few years after its inception, the department did not show any progress improving the country's education. Ronald Reagan, who was elected president in 1980, released his address on the country's education in 1983. He declared that 4/5 of our country's 17-year-olds can't write a persuasive essay, 2/3 can't solve mathematical problems involving more than one step, and nearly 40% can't draw inferences from reading. Now, if the department did not improve education within the 4 years after it was created, then surely in the 45 years it has existed, it must show some improvement, right? Unfortunately, that statement is incorrect. Vicki Alger, a research fellow for the Independent Institute, states that in reality, what we do know from publicly available spending and achievement data is that education spending has roughly tripled in real inflation adjustment terms, but student achievement has remained largely flat. This lack in student achievement can be seen when compared with other countries. Drew DeSilver from Pew Research Center states that from national mathematical and science assessments, they continue to indicate that U.S. students rank around the middle of the pack or far behind many other advanced industrialized nations. What Vicki Alger and Drew DeSilver help to propose is a question of why should the Department of Education exist if it hasn't done anything worthwhile since it was created in 1979? The answer simply is it should not. John Hood, a former president of the John Locke Foundation, also helps to show the uselessness of the Department of Education. In an article of his, The Failure of American Public Education, he states what happens to schools that are disconnected from a self-loathing Department of Education. Those schools with little influence from outside supervisors on hiring and firing decisions tend to be the most effective schools as measured by student performance. To provide the data, St. Thomas High School in Houston, Texas, published on the website statistics on the difference between non-funded private schools and funded public schools. They found that private schools excel in graduation rates with a 96.4% for the 2018-2019 school year. In contrast, the public school graduation rate was only 86%. They also published a difference on ACT scores between them, which showed that those educated in private education had scored an average ACT score of 24.2, up from 20.3 for public schools. As expected, these private schools, which are not chained to the Department of Education, are doing better academically than the public schools that are currently being ruined by it. A great outcome that would come from the abolishment of the Department of Education would, of course, be one less department to waste taxpayers' money. This department is a giant money pit, or maybe a better representation would be a giant pot with cracks in it. This giant pot has thousands upon thousands of dollars poured into it, only for a good percentage of that money to get lost through the cracks. This can be seen with the Charter School Fund Act that was added to the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1994. In 2019, Peter Green provided the details on the Charter School Program, CSP, stating that in 1995, they began dispersing federal funds to the states so that states could pilot charter schools. Since then, the CSP has handed out over $4 billion to support charter schools. However, Green found that roughly $1 billion of that has been lost to fraud or waste in the charter school sector. How does this happen? Again, complete neglect of the department's duties. Green mentions that the CSP grant process does not involve a verification of applicant contents, and that the Office of the Inspector General has made frequent recommendations that oversight be increased and controls tightened. Yet the department has knowingly ignored these problems. On a much wider view, Vicky Alger, again from the Independent Institute, states that currently the department receives $38 billion for its K-12 programs. Yet the assessment says these programs are plagued constantly with complex and persistent challenges. Now, it's not surprising that a federal department is plagued with complex and persistent challenges, but this country's education should not be caught in that, especially if these challenges are of its own making. One of these most recent challenges of its own making would, of course, be the failure for the department to release the free application for federal student aid, FAFSA, on time and ready for 2024. FAFSA is a very important program that many students rely on, whether it's to go to a college they can't afford or to go to college in general. FAFSA is directly connected to many students' futures, and the Department of Education should treat it with the utmost importance. However, this they did not do. Even with the extra year granted to them by Congress in March of 2022, the free application for federal student aid was not ready on time it was supposed to be for 2024. The Committee on Education and the Workforce recently sent a letter to the Department of Education declaring that, on January 30th of the newly 2024 year, declaring that post-enactment, the department should have expeditiously focused on the work that needed to be done for a successful and timely launch of the simplified FAFSA form for students and parents and institutions of higher education. Instead, what they got was long online waiting rooms, sporadic closures of the form, and network errors that made it impossible for students to fill it out. They continue stating that these problems currently have no workaround, and that the department has declared these roadblocks as some minor issues, yet they are far from minor. They are obstacles preventing many applicants from completing their applications and therefore from finalizing their college decisions. The department's poor handling of FAFSA is a representation of the inefficiency and laziness of the department. Its decisions affect so many futures that cannot be changed, and it has shown it is not competent enough to handle that responsibility. Now it is clear that the department is not as collective and efficient as it's supposed to be. An issue that arises from the idea of abolishing a department would, of course, be what would happen to the programs it has invested in U.S. schools. Frederick Hess, a director of education policy studies at the American Enterprise Institute, states the complexity of this issue in his article, What It Would Mean to Abolish the Department of Education. He states that whenever abolishment is brought up, it always gets bogged down by legal strings, federal oversight, and unknown possibilities that make it impossible that would happen. However, it is possible. The answer is actually given by Frederick Hess in his own statement when he asked the question in his article, does abolishing the department mean removing the federal government from education by eliminating federal programs and staff? Quite frankly, the answer is yes. It may be a very aggressive answer, seeing as many programs will be suddenly ripped out of the education system, but sometimes that is the best answer to something that is causing more harm than good. For example, one could see a weed in their garden. They could condemn it, remind it how much it is disliked, and hope it dies on its own, but that won't do any good. No, what one must do is rip it out there and then, and make sure there are no deep roots left. This is what must happen. America must stop condemning the disliked weed that is the Department of Education and rip it out. Only then can the garden of education flourish. Surely it can be said that the Department of Education is doing its best to ensure safety and security within the schools it supports. Surely it would not fund schools that is actively harming its students. On the outside, this appears to be true. However, when one takes a closer look, something else seems to appear. Currently, the U.S. Department of Education estimates that 1 in 10 children are forced to endure sexual abuse by school employees. NBC News did the math in an article from 2004. They declared that more than 4.5 million students are forced to endure sexual misconduct by school employees, whether it's inappropriate comments to physical abuse. This shocking realization disturbed many Americans and caused a wave of distrust in the public education system. However, Michael Pons of the National Education Association tried to quell this distrust, saying that Lumping together harassment with serious sexual misconduct does more harm than good. It creates unjustified alarm and undermines confidence in public schools. He finishes saying that statistically, public schools remain one of the safest places for children to be today. May the listener be reminded that the statement came out in 2004. Therefore, today, this problem should have been addressed, dealt with, and faith restored in our safe public schools. Unfortunately, as expected with the education system, the matter has not gotten better, but in fact worse. The Committee on Education and the Workforce displays a report from 2023 that shows a pattern of gross misconduct by school officials and the Department of Education, who is beholden to teachers' unions, to conceal, directly or indirectly, sexual abuse in K-12 schools. Cases of sexual abuse have tripled in the last decade, but instead of terminations and investigations, perpetrators are instead moved to another school or another district or given an administrative job. Hold on there. So not only is the Department of Education and the teachers' unions ignoring these problems, they are actively hiding it and sweeping it under the rug. Why should anyone have any trust in the Department of Education when it is hiding the truth from American citizens? This is just a minuscule amount of information on the corrupt, tyrannical, unjust, and destructive Department of Education. The evidence is laid in the courtroom of America. Its citizens, being the judge, jury, and executioner, are ready to convict it. No more waiting, no more hesitation. It must go. The floor is now open to questions.
Really well done. What would you were to be the one to overhaul that?
I take after Ronald Reagan. I think he's one of the greatest politicians and presidents we've had. But I agree with him when he said he wanted to return it to the states entirely. As the Constitution also says, any powers not delegated to the United States, the national government, is left for the states. So it should go back to the way it was before 1979. Yes?
Very well done. A follow-up question on that. Do you feel that a more localized government would be efficient in resolving any of these national issues?
More vocalized, what do you mean by that?
More localized.
Oh, localized. Oh, okay. Sorry. Yes, I thought I heard vocalized. Sorry. Yeah, localized. I think they're more in contact and more involved than, of course, the giant government that heads our country. Of course, they wouldn't be able to keep as close of tabs down the line because you have this person talking to this person talking to this person. If you lessen that chain, then it's more likely things would get done.
I have two questions. One, did you find any benefits to the Department of Education?
Any benefits?
Yeah, have they done any? Are they doing anything at all?
They list on their website their benefits is supporting national education averages to look better to other countries and to promote general welfare. Clearly, I've showed that they don't promote general welfare well enough when I talked about this sexual misconduct. But I would say the only benefit I could see is them handing out money. That's really all they can do.
The second question I had, because of the research you've done, you talked about charter schools and private schools, and public schools in there. You really didn't address in the paper, so I guess it's just really your opinion now. What do you think of like the voucher system and parents being able to choose that? If Department of Education were to go away, do you think that fits, or do you think it's not?
Is the voucher system where the government hands money to?
Right, where in other words, a parent can choose where to go based on their money goes with them from the states.
I could definitely see that the voucher system would be incredibly affected by the idea that the government can no longer hand out money to these public systems. So are you saying that like this is the idea that voucher system still exists, or what would happen to it?
Yeah, they're currently even debating that here in Louisiana. So nothing decided. Didn't know if you thought that or not.
I don't really have an answer on that.
Okay.
Yeah.
What exactly does the Department of Education do?
What does it do? It provides funding, kind of, I wouldn't really say quota, but it's depending on the schools and where they are, especially as I stated in big cities, they get plenty of more funding. And in my paper, I did not get to it, unfortunately, but I do have a paragraph before the conclusion that talks about the difference between rural and urban schools. And rural schools get almost nothing from the Department of Education. They get their yearly salary or so. Yet, actually, rural schools have better graduation rates than the public schools in urban areas. And it states there that clearly the only reason why kids in rural schools do better is that it's actually the community knows each other so well enough that they actually receive general care. They actually want to see them succeed. Versus these schools that get all this money, all this tech and equipment, but still that care isn't there. And so they don't even succeed with all this equipment and such.
And then you made a claim that you think that the Department of Education is corrupt. Why do you think it's corrupt?
So from the beginning, as I stated, it was a kind of a corrupt bargain that was made to bring it into power. The teaching unions have, and I can't really like go into the details of this, but teaching unions have always had a corrupt side to them, and they're the ones who wanted the federal Department of Education because they wanted to lobby their power into the national government. And I see that, first of all, as a horrible beginning, and it has shown that it covers up misdealings, it covers up sexual misconduct, it supports one school over another, depending on where they are.
Gotcha. It seems like the Department of Education was mainly founded to be a philosophical influence, especially for liberal kind of ideas. It's harder to understand the corruption.
Yeah, but as soon as money gets involved.
Yeah, I
So I'm actually glad you referenced that paragraph that you didn't.
Yeah, I didn't have it fully memorized by the time I was here, so
I do understand.
I wasn't going to attempt it.
Well, since you've referenced it, it's actually quite compelling to me. You write, rural schools are facing conditions far worse than those of urban areas. In the Times article, it states that rural areas are often disconnected from the nonprofits and social service agencies that plug holes in urban and suburban schools. So you go on to say they have less resources. Then you say they actually have better results, citing some evidence here about test scores and graduation rates. And then you say, why is this? The answer is given. When we talk to rural students and staff and parents about their school, we hear one word again, care. So you're making the case that like the smaller community tends to maintain care that's often lost in the bigger urban areas. So I guess my question is like, do you see abolishing the Department of Education as the answer? I guess like if we were to do that today, the word that comes to my mind is like mayhem in the cities. Like, is there not some sort of kind of like staying power there that's keeping things together? And what would the subsequent steps be to get things in order? Because I think that what's working in the rural areas is the care, but you've already said that doesn't exist in the urban areas. So that feels like throwing it to the wolves. What's your response to that?
You really got to give me the hard ones here. No, I would say definitely the thing that substitutes for care in the major urban cities is definitely just money. The amount of money that's being put in there. It would probably definitely cause mayhem. So it would have, if we can't abolish the department right out, it would have to be a process. But again, this process comes down to whenever something gets put into a process, it usually gets blocked out. So I don't really know what would happen.
Sure. So just one other follow-up question.
Mhm.
I'm interested if you bring like, any other parts of your education into this, even theologically speaking. So if we do away with the Department of Education, what's the grassroots that needs to come up to shore up the caring community? Like, as Isaiah, what also needs to happen to transform education?
This would be another thesis in itself. But I would say, of course, the reinstallment of religion in education. Of course, it was removed because the idea of the separation between church and government, but religion had a certain place in education that held that what we see in rural areas, which tend to be pretty religious, a general care for others. It brought good rules. It brought a good morality. And when you take away this key factor in societies, as I said, the classical education system that built this country had religion as one of its major key factors. It starts to dissolve.
I appreciate that.
Mhm.
You've done a good job.
Thank you.
Okay, I have a question.
Okay. Yeah.
So I agree with you. You should get rid of the Department of Education.
Mhm.
But one of the things that you talked a lot about, one of the things that the Department of Education does is it sort of sets a national curriculum. Okay?
Yeah.
Now, it trends with fads and whatever. That's why we've had some crazy things that have had to be taught in the past. If it all goes back to the states, do you think there should be some, because who's to say California's requirements for their students would be so vastly different from Louisiana's requirements for their students?
Mhm.
Should there be some sort of national oversight to see that everyone's basically getting the same thing? So if you, as a Louisiana graduate, want to attend school in New York, you're meeting all the same. Are you following?
Yes,
what I'm
yeah.
saying?
And I do.
That we're sort of all
yeah.
doing similar things.
And I do believe that there should definitely be a agreed upon curriculum, and not every school has to follow it, of course. But I do believe that for public schools especially, there has to be an agreed upon curriculum. However, even with the Department of Education, you could take what's it called? Common Core. Thank you. Everybody said it. Everybody knows it. But even with Common Core, the Department of Education actually found a way to separate itself from that, saying that all it did was fund schools that took it. Common Core was actually by many schools who accepted it was not even used. It was actually when it failed, the Department of Education said, "Oh, all we did was fund it. We had nothing to do with it," even though they actively supported it. And if the Department of Education, of course, all it did was provide the funding for it, I think if schools are able to provide the funding, there could be something agreed upon that where multiple schools can work together and choose, like, hey, we're going to accept this, and it could be multiple for like colleges, like, oh, you were part of this one, and they know what you've done. All right, if there's no more any questions, I'm going to close the floor and end it here. Thank you.